A group of women threw a party turned sleepover in Georgia, and it was all laughs, drinks, and card games until one guest by the name of Tamla Horsford was found dead in the backyard the following morning. The story that they all tell is simple. She fell from the deck, but the injuries are far more complex than that. She had a broken neck, a lacerated heart, and a blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit, and no one saw or heard a thing. No one called 911 for hours. As Tamla's family demanded answers, contradictions emerged, including conflicting witness statements and troubling gaps in the forensic report. Public pressure forced the case to be reopened, and after 2 investigations, officials still insist that it was an accident, but for many, it still doesn't add up. Was this a tragic fall or something else entirely? Even if you've heard her story before, today we're going to take a deep dive look into this from a nurse's perspective that you are not going to want to miss. Welcome to the True Crime Nurse, everybody. My name is Kat, and I'm a registered nurse who loves all things nursing and true crime. Don't forget to subscribe and leave me a comment down below for any case recommendations that you have, and I will be sure to take a look into them. All right, everyone, let's get into today's case. Tamla Ayanna Horsford, known lovingly as Tam, was a 40-year-old wife known to Leander, who was also known as Lee. Tam was born in the Caribbean and met her husband and his daughter in Florida, and they very quickly became a blended family. Together, they had 5 additional boys, making their family a grand total of 8. Eventually, Leander got a job in Forsyth County, Cumming, Georgia, to be specific, and the family relocated for that role. She was described as a real-life supermom and was truly the heart of their family. Almost even more exciting, though, the parents found out that they were going to be grandparents, and Tamla was over the moon excited about this news. But on the evening of November 3rd, 2018, she attended a birthday slumber party at a friend's house. That party was to celebrate a fellow football mom's 45th birthday, and several of them actually planned to spend the night that night. Tamla didn't know everyone there very well, but everyone that met her said Tamla was super social and made friends very easily. In fact, Jean, one of the women that were throwing the party, described Tamla as someone who, quote, has always been the life of the party, end quote, and had a warm, upbeat presence who could literally uplift anybody. The party took place at a 2-story suburban home. The home belonged to Jean Myers, the birthday girl and host, who had invited several friends over that night. There were also a few men present at the house, specifically Jean's boyfriend, Jose Barrera, and at least one other spouse. In total, about 12 people were in the house that night. Many of them were part of a close social circle of friends, but Tamla was a bit of an outsider since she was new to that group. On that night of November 3rd, the group of friends at Jean Myers' house settled in for their slumber party. Tamla arrived at about 10 p.m. She'd actually spent most of that evening at home baking a breakfast casserole for her husband and their 5 children to have the following morning, since she planned to spend that night. Making her family breakfast before even leaving to go out just paints an accurate picture of the loving wife and mother that Tamla was. Friends and family remember her as someone generous, big-hearted, and who wouldn't allow anybody around her to be in a bad mood. Once there, she reportedly greeted everyone and joined the party. They all watched the LSU-Alabama football game since it was a big game that night, and later switched to playing card games like Cards Against Humanity. Throughout the evening, snacks were eaten and drinks were pouring. Tamla's drink of choice was from the tequila bottle that she actually brought over to share with everybody that night. According to statements later given by those present, Tamla was the only one that was drinking the tequila. Others were consuming different types of drinks like beer and wine, but Tamla preferred her tequila drink. The bottle, which had been unopened at the start of the night, was about 7/8 empty by the end of it, suggesting that Tamla had consumed a significant amount of it. Despite the alcohol flowing, witnesses said that the party remained in really good spirits. Tamla was described as cheerful and not visibly impaired earlier on in that night. Photos and short videos that were taken of her throughout that night showed her smiling and interacting normally. One photo later in the evening actually shows Tamla posing in her white paw print pajamas, appearing really happy. As an experienced mother in her 40s, Tamla likely had some tolerance for alcohol. Still, unknown to everyone at the time, her blood alcohol content would later be measured at a very high level, nearly 3 times the legal driving limit. But at the moment, nothing seemed off. Around 11:30 p.m. to midnight, a few guests who weren't going to spend the night said their goodbyes and they left. The home's front door had a security system that logged each and every time the door opened or closed, which actually later helped in the investigation to confirm everyone that was coming and going. These logs indicated multiple exits in the late night hours as some people were leaving the party. By about 1 in the morning, the remaining group was significantly smaller. Most of the women who were staying over had begun winding down for bed. Some went to sleep in the upstairs bedroom, and others crashed on sofas. Jean Myers herself went to bed at some point around 1 a.m., leaving Tamla and perhaps one or two other people still awake. Tamla was known to be somewhat of a night owl, and she also was a smoker. In fact, she was the only smoker in the group that night. Because Jean's house was non-smoking indoors, Tamla would step outside to that back deck when she wanted to smoke a cigarette. The back deck was on the second story of the home, which was actually connected to the kitchen area by a door. It had a set of wooden stairs that led down to the backyard lawn, too. Sometime around 1:30 to 1:45, Tamla headed out to that back deck for what everyone assumed was one last cigarette before bed. Security logs showed the back door opening at 1:47 in the morning, and there was no record of it closing afterwards. This suggests that Tamla opened the back door to go onto the deck around that time and possibly left it open behind her. Friends later recalled that the last that they saw of Tamla was between 1:30 and 2 in the morning when she was heading outside saying that she was going to have a cigarette and then go to bed. No one reported seeing or hearing from Tamla again after that point that night. It's reported that while she was out on the deck, the other remaining guests either had gone to sleep or were in other parts of the house at that time. There were adjacent neighbors, but no one next door reported hearing any disturbances. One party attendee by the name of Stacy Smith left the house around this time, shortly before 2 a.m., and later told police that she saw Tamla still up and planning to smoke, but nothing seemed odd at that time. The next events can only be reconstructed from evidence, but there were no direct witnesses to what took place. An unlit cigarette and a lighter were found on the back deck, suggesting that Tamla may have lit or was attempting to light a cigarette and set her lighter down. Investigators theorized at some point in the early morning darkness, Tamla fell from the deck to the ground below. The distance from the deck railing to the ground was approximately 14 feet or about 4.3 meters. The backyard was grass covered, with another patio directly under the deck and also had a grassy lawn that extended outward. Tamla's fall, if that's what happened, was a steep fall into the dark of the night. There were no obvious obstacles or railings that had been broken, meaning that she either accidentally tumbled over the railing or perhaps slipped off of the stairs. One theory proposed later was that Tamla might have leaned over the deck railing, possibly to vomit because she had been drinking heavily and lost her balance. Another theory was that she may have sat on the railing or stood on top of something and fell. However, all of this is completely speculative since no one actually saw the moment that she fell. What is known is that Tamla never made it back inside the house. The back door that she had opened remained opened. The temperature outside was really chilly in early November. Tamla was barefoot and dressed only in her pajama onesie and socks when she went outside. Sometime around 2 a.m. or shortly after, Tamla Horsford sustained a devastating fall from the second-story deck. The impact left her unmoving in the grass. There she would remain for several hours until daylight. Morning came on November 4th, 2018 with an unimaginable shock. At about 7:30 in the morning, Jean Myers' aunt, Madeline Lombardi, was up and about. Madeline, who also lived at that home, stepped outside onto the back deck that morning just to have a cup of coffee. It was then that she noticed something alarming in the backyard, a figure laying on the grass, not moving. After a closer look, she recognized that figure as Tamla. Tamla was face down, also known as the prone position on the ground, just beyond the lower patio, with her head pointing away from the house. Her feet were towards the house and her arms were down by her side, or at least that's how it initially appeared to Madeline in her shock. Madeline rushed back inside to let Jean know that something terribly had gone wrong outside. According to later accounts, Madeline was distraught and described finding Jean's, quote, friend from the islands, end quote, which was a reference to Tamla, who had those Caribbean roots that I'd mentioned earlier on, lying in the background and not moving. Jean Myers and her boyfriend Jose ran to see for themselves. What they saw was devastating. Tamla was lying face down in the grass. She was not responding or showing any signs of life. When they touched her, she already felt cold and stiff. Rigor mortis had set in, indicating that Tamla had been dead for some time. It was immediately obvious that this was far beyond a medical emergency. Tamla was already gone. At 8:59 in the morning, a 911 call was placed by Jose Barrera. In that recorded call, which was later released to the public, Jose's voice is urgently telling the operator that there is a woman, quote, lying face down in the backyard who is not moving one bit and not breathing, end quote. He reports that she appeared to be stiff and that it's possible that she fell from the balcony. Am I the only one that's not understanding, though, why they found her at 7:30 and it took them an hour and a half to call the authorities? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Jose also mentions a small cut on Tamla's wrist and speculates that it could be self-inflicted, but there is no evidence beyond that wound to suggest anything otherwise. In the background of the call, a second voice, likely Jean, can also be heard talking. The woman's voice says, quote, "She was drinking and it looks like, I'm guessing maybe she fell off the balcony," end quote, offering an immediate theory for what may have happened. At one point on the call, that female voice also says, quote, "Okay, what happened," end quote, and even speculates in somewhat of a panicked tone, quote, "Or maybe she was pushed," end quote. I cannot be the only one here that finds that to be somewhat of a red flag. Forsyth County Sheriff's Office deputies and EMS were dispatched immediately after the call. Just to clarify from the nursing perspective, the reason that EMS is still dispatched is not because they don't trust the person on that call that Tamla had already passed away, but they need to be the ones to confirm that. If she hadn't passed away, then obviously they would be trying to save her life. According to official records, the first responders arrived at the scene at 9:07 a.m., just a few minutes after that call took place. Deputies quickly secured the backyard and assessed Tamla's condition. There were no signs of life. Tamla was beyond resuscitation. She was officially pronounced dead at the scene by EMS once they arrived. The position of Tamla's body and the scene were documented by responding officers. Tamla was found face down, oriented parallel to the house. Her head was pointing away from the residence and slightly downhill on the lawn. One arm, her left arm, was extended outward and bent at the elbow with the hand away from her body. The other arm, her right arm, was straight against her side. Contrary to initial impressions from the panicked witnesses, crime scene photos later showed that Tamla's left arm was not exactly, quote, "down by her side, palm up," end quote, as Jean had initially described. Instead, that arm was out to the side with the palm down and fingers curled under her body. This discrepancy may have been due to the stress of the moment, but it would later be noted as a really small but possibly significant inconsistency. Tamla's legs were extended straight behind her as well. Her white pajama onesie and socks were visibly soiled from the ground. Investigators observed that a part of her bone was protruding from her right fractured wrist, which is a clear indication of injury, possibly sustained while trying to brace the impact of her fall, which is absolutely heartbreaking. There were also obvious signs of trauma. For example, she had visible cuts on her body, including a cut lip, and there was also some blood at the scene, but not a large amount. A small amount of blood was found on her face, head area, and on the grass beside her, which is consistent with injuries from an abrupt impact. Deputies at the scene immediately felt that Tamla appeared to have fallen from the second-story deck. The ground below was grass and dirt and was relatively soft, but still unforgiving to a 14-foot drop. Tamla's body was found a short distance out from the base of the deck stairs, suggesting that she didn't simply just tumble down those steps, but instead she had to have gone over the railing from the deck itself. One of her shoes was reportedly on the patio and the other was on the grass area. Details on the shoe placement vary a little bit in the reports, but both shoes were found on scene. That unlit cigarette and lighter that I had already mentioned were recovered from the upper deck area near a table, indicating that Tamla had likely lit a cigarette or was about to whenever what happened occurred. The back door to the house was found open by the first responders, aligning with the security log that it hadn't been closed after Tamla went outside. For the responding Forsyth County deputies, the scene clearly pointed to a tragic accident. There were no signs of struggle on the deck or inside the home. Nothing obvious like overturned furniture or broken rails were present. The people in the house who were awakened by the alert or by the crisis were emotional and in shock. Jean Myers was reportedly distraught, and some of the other women were also crying. Deputies separated the party attendees and began the process of securing the area as a potential crime scene. They roped off the backyard and the deck to prevent any contamination of evidence. Detectives from the Forsyth County Sheriff's Office and Major Crimes Unit were both called in. Crime scene investigators, or CSI, and an investigator from the Forsyth County Coroner's Office also arrived. Photos were taken of the exterior of the house, the back deck from multiple angles, the position of the items like Tamla's shoes and cigarettes, and the position of her body were all photographed and sketched before she was moved. Measurements were also taken, documenting the distance from how far the deck and the body was, the height of the deck railing, and more. Officers did find one unusual detail during the initial scene processing. In Tamla's overnight bag, which was found inside the house by the front hallway, they did find a small bag of marijuana among her other personal belongings. They also found Tamla's personal items, like her wallet and ID, confirming her identity. By about 10 a.m. to 10:30 in the morning, investigators had gathered initial statements from those that were at the house. All the partygoers present told the same story. It had been a normal, fun night, and they went to bed with Tamla still awake. No one claimed to have heard any screams or loud noises during that night. One person did mention that they thought they may have heard something that could have been a noise on the deck in the morning, but they weren't sure, and it wasn't something that was alarming enough to investigate at the time. The homeowner's aunt, Madeline, also mentioned that she had, on previous occasions, tripped over the landscape edge in the yard and initially thought that maybe Tamla had fallen in the yard somehow. In fact, as Tamla's husband later stated, one of the first things authorities mentioned to him that morning was a theory that Tamla might have tripped over an object in the backyard while walking around and fatally hurt herself in that way. However, as they examined the extensive injuries to Tamla's body, a fall from the deck became the leading theory rather than a ground level fall. Once the scene investigation was completed, the coroner's office took custody of Tamla's body. Her body was carefully bagged and removed from the scene around late morning. Along with the body, investigators sent along certain evidence for further examination as well. The nearly empty tequila bottle that Tamla had been drinking from was collected and sent with her to the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, or GBI, medical examiner's lab for analysis. And if you're wondering, yes, this is the same office that handled Kendrick Johnson's case. This was done to test if the bottle or its contents had any relevance to what may have happened, like verifying that she had been drinking something that hadn't been spiked by those people at the party. Friends and family of Tamla were notified of this terrible news. For them, the nightmare was just beginning, though. Her family, especially her husband and children, were absolutely devastated. The question on everyone's mind was, how could a beloved mother of 5, out for a fun night with friends, end up dead in a backyard? On November 5th, 2018, the day after Tamla Horsford was found, a forensic pathologist at the GBI medical examiner's office did their autopsy. The purpose of the autopsy was to establish the cause and manner of death and to catalog every injury or unusual finding. What the medical examiner found would later be described in detail in the autopsy report and would heavily influence the direction of this entire investigation. We're going to be diving in pretty heavily into this part of today's case from the nursing perspective, so just get ready. Externally, or on the outside, Tamla's body showed multiple areas of trauma consistent with the fall from a significant height. There were numerous abrasions or scrapes and contusions or bruises on her head and extremities, meaning her arms and legs. There were cuts on her face, including the forehead and the chin, and a laceration on the bridge of her nose. Small abrasions were noted on her wrists and the back of her hands, as well as her shins and the lower legs. These kinds of scrapes are commonly seen when a body contacts the ground during a fall. For example, sliding or tumbling on the grass or dirt can also cause these types of injuries. One particular external injury, though, that stood out was on Tamla's right wrist. Like we touched on earlier, it was dislocated and had an open fracture where a portion of the bone, the distal radius bone near the wrist, protruded through her skin. This gruesome injury was visible in some of the pictures that had been taken on scene. It suggested that Tamla may have instinctively reached out her arms to break her fall as she hit the ground, which is actually an instinctual reflex known as Cole's fracture, where the wrist takes the impact. Pathologists recognize that kind of injury as being consistent with a fall from up high because people often extend their arms in an attempt to brace themselves for impact, leading to that broken or dislocated wrist. On her head, Tamla had blunt force injuries, including a lump on the crown of her skull and a laceration or tear on the right side of her forehead. There was also a laceration on the right side of her heart, specifically to the right ventricle. This internal injury, a laceration to the cardiac muscle, can occur when the chest experiences a severe blunt impact, causing the heart to collide forcefully with the rib cage or sternum. I personally have only seen this one time in my nursing career from a severe car accident, so this impact had to have been catastrophic. In Tamla's case, the medical examiner found that one of her ribs had been fractured and a piece of bone likely lacerated the right ventricle of her heart on impact. A tear in the heart's ventricle would have caused massive internal bleeding into her chest cavity, which is life-threatening. This injury alone could explain immediate or rapid death because bleeding into the pericardial sac or the chest can stop the heart. For those of you that don't know, that sac around your heart is there to protect it. So a bone piercing through that sac and into the chamber of the heart and profusely bleeding internally would absolutely be fatal. It was one of the most significant internal findings from her autopsy. As far as skeletal injuries go, the autopsy documented multiple blunt force injuries to Tamla's head, neck, and torso. Among these was a fracture to the C2 vertebra in her neck, meaning that her neck had also been broken. A broken neck can be fatal or incapacitating on its own, potentially causing damage to the spinal cord and paralysis. It's not stated that her spinal cord was injured, but the presence of a broken neck is a grave injury that, in combination with all the other trauma, supports a high-impact fall scenario as well. In addition to the neck, there were also fractures in the rib cage. At least one rib on the right side that we'd mentioned earlier caused that laceration to her heart. Beyond the skeletal injuries, though, Tamla suffered internal organ injuries that were also consistent with a high fall. While the specific report of a subdural hematoma isn't explicitly quoted in the initial documents that I found, the medical examiner did note, quote, severe injuries to her head, end quote. This suggests that there may have been a hematoma or bleeding or swelling in the brain due to the head impact. That neck fracture itself indicates a significant whiplash or direct impact to the head and neck area, though. The reports also mention torso trauma and severe injuries, which typically includes internal bruising or tears to the organs in the chest and abdomen. For example, in many falls, people can suffer a pulmonary contusion, which means bruised lungs, or a liver laceration, but the report focused on the heart and the general head and torso trauma. The official cause of death determined by the GBI medical examiner was multiple blunt force injuries. In other words, Tamla died due to the combined trauma from falling roughly 14 feet and hitting the ground. It's important to mention that the autopsy did not find any specific injuries that were unmistakably from an assault, like a stab wound, gunshot, or strangulation marks. There were no defensive wounds on her arms or hands beyond the fall-related injuries. A sexual examination kit was reportedly not performed at that time because nothing at the scene or on the body suggested an assault had occurred. Later, this omission and even the absence of autopsy photos, because the GBI's medical examiner did not take any photos of Tamla's body, would be huge points of contention. However, GBI officials explained that those steps are not routine in cases where the evidence does not immediately indicate foul play. In their judgment, Tamla's injuries were consistent with an accidental fall, so certain forensic protocols that are reserved for suspected homicides, like nail scrapings or extensive photography of the body, were not performed. A critical part of the autopsy was the toxicology test on Tamla's blood and urine. The results showed that Tamla had a blood alcohol concentration of 0.238% at the time of her death. To put this into perspective, that is nearly 3 times the legal driving limit of 0.08%, and that indicates a very high level of intoxication. This high of a BAC can cause significant impairment like loss of balance, motor coordination difficulties, and confusion. Think about the test that you see police officers do all the time in the streets. All of it's focused on seeing if you have any of those deficits. This finding supported the theory that alcohol intoxication could have contributed to a loss of footing or an accident. In addition to alcohol, toxicology detected traces of THC and alprazolam in her system. This is an anti-anxiety medication commonly known by the brand name Xanax. The report did not share exact levels of these substances beyond traces, but it did show that at some point Tamla had used marijuana and possibly alprazolam that night. Now, it's unclear if she was prescribed this medication or if someone gave her some, but regardless, the presence of THC and Xanax in small amounts, combined with a large quantity of alcohol, meant that Tamla was under the influence. Central nervous system depressants like alcohol and Xanax can have a synergistic effect, with each amplifying the other's impact, potentially causing greater drowsiness and loss of coordination. This is actually something that we touched on in the Kanika Jenkins video, if you remember. This toxicology finding was a key factor in the medical examiner's conclusion that the manner of death was likely accidental. I want to add here, though, that everyone has different tolerance levels, and I have personally seen patients present with lab work that should make someone present as if they're under the influence, and they don't. Just food for thought as we continue to unpack this case. After reviewing all the injuries and the toxicology, the GBI medical examiner ruled Tamla's manner of death as an accident consistent with a fall. By February 6, 2019, the final autopsy report was delivered to the sheriff's office confirming this. The pathology evidence did not conclusively point to homicide. Instead, it indicated that Tamla died because she fell from the balcony while heavily intoxicated, which led to injuries that were terrible but aligned with what might have happened in the fall. Tamla's family, having a lot of doubt about this finding, later commissioned an independent autopsy by a non-governmental forensic pathologist. This second autopsy, performed once Tamla's body was released back to her family, aimed to double-check for any signs of foul play that might have been missed. When its results came back, the independent examiner's conclusions were the same in terms of cause of death. They also found that the injuries were consistent with the fall and did not identify a different cause. However, the independent autopsy did document some additional minor injuries or abrasions that the initial report hadn't emphasized. For example, family attorneys later mentioned that the second autopsy added certain scratches or abrasions that, quote, had not been documented originally, end quote. The autopsy didn't contradict the original cause of death, and it still concluded multiple blunt force injuries from the fall. The family's pathologist did not find any evidence of strangulation, gunshot, stabbing, or any clear defensive wounds that would have screamed homicide either. One point later raised by the family's attorney was the lack of autopsy photos taken by the GBI medical examiner, though. The GBI's pathologist did not take photographs of Tamla's body during the examination. The family found this highly unusual, and their attorney called the absence of these photos, quote, completely unheard of, end quote. The GBI later responded that while photos are common, it's not mandatory, and in a case initially deemed an accident, the examiner would not typically deem it necessary. Still, to the family, this felt like a lapse in judgment. Without those photos, they had to rely on the written descriptions of the injuries, which they worried might omit something subtle that pictures could later reveal. So, the injuries were consistent with the fall, but could they also be consistent with a physical struggle or an assault? The Horsford family noticed injuries like abrasions on Tamla's wrists and arms that might look like defensive wounds or signs of being grabbed. Could the pattern of how her body was found indicate that she was placed or fallen? The experts said no, but skepticism continued. These doubts fueled the family's push for further investigation, even though autopsies aligned with the accident narrative. From the moment Tamla's death was discovered on November 4, 2018, the Forsyth County Sheriff's Office treated it as a mysterious death investigation, though. The detectives knew they had to leave no stone unturned given the unusual circumstances. Over the next several weeks, November 2018 through February 2019, Forsyth County authorities conducted an extensive investigation into the incident. Major crimes unit detectives interviewed everyone who had been at the party, in some cases multiple times. In total, about 30 interviews were conducted, including the party attendees, people who even left earlier in the night, neighbors, and some of Tamla's family and friends. According to Forsyth County summary, detectives spent, quote, well over 300 man-hours, unquote, on this case. This included reenacting some of the aspects of the event and thoroughly reviewing the evidence collected. In addition to interviews, one key piece of evidence was the home security log from the Myers residence. The investigators obtained the data showing every time a door was opened or closed that night. These logs corroborated witness statements for people as far as when they left and when Tamla likely had went out to the deck for that last time. For example, the front door log confirmed the times that different guests had left, which several left around 11:30 and one left at 1:47 in the morning and so on, and that back log door captured it opening at 1:47 with it never being closed, supporting that Tamla went out and never came back inside. But does this mean that nobody could have followed her outside? The sheriff's investigators found that these electronic timestamps matched closely with what the partygoers had stated, which increased their confidence that there wasn't an unknown intruder or other people at the home beyond those that they knew had been there. Detectives also conducted neighborhood canvasses going door to door to see if any neighbors had heard or seen anything unusual that night or morning. Nobody reported anything like a scream or commotion. One neighbor thought that they might have heard voices or a dog barking, but nothing that stood out as an emergency. The timing of the incident meant that there were likely going to be no witnesses, and investigators had already anticipated that. Meanwhile, the physical evidence was processed. The GBI crime lab tested Tamla's blood, which we've already touched on with the BAC level, but they also examined the contents of what was inside of the tequila bottle that Tamla had brought over. It contained alcohol that was consistent with what they had expected to find, and there were no signs that it had been tampered with. The small bag of marijuana found in Tamla's belongings was cataloged, and it wasn't really pertinent to the cause of death, except to confirm her positive result. Investigators looked at Tamla's cell phone and clues to see if she had texted or called anyone that night. There was no concerning communication, though. Her last known phone activity was sending a Snapchat to a friend around midnight, but nothing on her phone suggested that she was in distress of any type. As far as questioning went, during an interview, an investigator directly asked Jose Barrera, the boyfriend of the host, if he had any involvement in Tamla's death, even bluntly asking if he had, quote, thrown Tamla over the deck, end quote. Jose denied it. This direct question indicates that investigators were considering all possibilities, including an altercation or homicide, even if they had no evidence to support it at that point. Jose, like the others, maintained that this was a tragic accident and nothing more. Another area that detectives explored was whether or not any physical altercation could have happened. Did Tamla wander back inside and get into an argument with somebody? Did someone follow her outside? Again, according to police, there was no evidence to support that, but there's also no evidence to support that that couldn't have happened either. The door didn't log another person going out after her because the door remained open, and those who were awake, like the man that had been sleeping on the couch, reported hearing nothing. The scene on the deck showed no overturned furniture or spilled drinks that night that could signal a fight. Could someone that intoxicated put up a fight, though? Tamla's body and clothing also showed no telltale signs of a struggle or grasp marks on her arms or neck. There were some fingernail injuries noted, and specifically on the same wrist that she had had broken. Investigators wondered if these could be defensive wounds or if maybe they had come from hitting a blunt object or during the fall. Given the lack of any other indications of struggle, they leaned toward it happening from the fall. On February 20th, 2019, the Forsyth County Sheriff's Office officially announced that it was closing the investigation into Tamla Horsford's death, concluding that it was an accidental death with no evidence of foul play. Major Joe Perkins of the Sheriff's Office held a press briefing where he summarized the case and the findings. Perkins acknowledged that Tamla had died during a party where there was alcohol being consumed and said, quote, "It was a party. They were drinking. She was drinking. Most of the partygoers had gone to bed at that time, and she was on the deck alone," end quote. This statement emphasized that the Sheriff's Department perspective was that she had been drinking heavily and she fell unsupervised outside on her own. Perkins further emphasized that all the injuries were consistent with the fall. The case was considered solved to the extent that they could explain how Tamla died, even if tragically it was an unexplained accident. The Sheriff's Office press release outlined all the work that they had done: the 30 interviews, numerous tests, scene reconstructions, and a consultation with the GBI. Sheriff Ron Freeman expressed condolences to Tamla's family and friends for their loss and stated that the investigative team had done their due diligence in the search for truth. Forsyth County authorities felt confident that what had happened was a combination of intoxication and an unfortunate accident with no one to criminally blame. However, the case was not closed. Not everyone was satisfied. Tamla's family and friends had lingering doubts and suspicions about the situation from the very beginning. For one, Tamla's husband and relatives struggled to accept that she simply could have fallen without an outcry or sound waking anyone else that was there. To them, Tamla was relatively athletic and coordinated. Could she really have just toppled over a deck railing that stood about 3.5 feet high? Friends who visited the deck after the incident noted that the rail was sturdy and about chest high on Tamla, and that doesn't seem like something a person would easily flip over, even while drunk. One of the women at the party by the name of Stacy Smith even expressed her doubts to detectives 2 weeks after the death. She told police that she had tried to physically lean over the deck railing herself, reenacting what might have happened to Tamla if she had been sick or lost her balance, and Stacy said, quote, "I don't get it at all. I've looked and I've tried to imagine it and I don't understand," end quote. The interviewing officer acknowledged her confusion but still leaned toward the false scenario, speculating that maybe Tamla had sat on the rail to smoke or something. Stacy noted that Tamla hadn't been acting ill or woozy despite her high BAC, which other interviews and party videos also supported. Tamla appeared fairly steady and not like someone that was about to physically be sick or uncoordinated. 2 months after Tamla's death, an event occurred that fueled public suspicion further. Jose Barrera, the homeowner's boyfriend who had been at the party and made that 911 call, was fired from his job as Forsyth County court officer in December 2018. The reason? He had improperly accessed the incident report on Tamla's case using his work computer. Jose looked up the confidential police report multiple times out of curiosity, which is something that he was not authorized to do. The sheriff's office discovered this and reported it to his superiors immediately. By December 20th, 2018, Jose was terminated for this breach, cited, quote, as a loss of confidence, end quote, in him due to his misuse of government databases. Major Joe Perkins later commented, quote, "He had access to our system and he should not have done what he did. He accessed those reports, which again upsets us. It violated our trust with him, and we reported him to his supervisors, end quote. News of Jose's firing became public in February 2019, about the same time that the case was closed. When local media reported that an employee who was at that party had been caught looking in the case files, it obviously raised eyebrows. Why was he checking the reports? Was there something that he had to hide? Jose, through his attorneys, maintained that, quote, curiosity got the best of him, end quote, and that he had no hidden agenda. He was just anxious to know what the investigators were writing about since he was there. In an interview with a local paper, Jose also denied a separate allegation that had come up. A woman named Michelle Graves, who's a friend of Tamla's family, accused him of using police resources to look up her personal information and share it publicly, possibly because she had been questioning the case on social media. Jose denied this, saying any information on Michelle was public and he hadn't illegally leaked anything about her. Regardless of the specifics, the fact remained that a key witness was fired for inappropriately accessing case information. This gave momentum to online talk about Tamla's death too. By the spring of 2019, many people on social media had begun to share the hashtag Tamla Horsford, expressing doubts about the official narrative and calling for justice for Tamla. Some skeptics of the investigation pointed out that Forsyth's law enforcement had had a well-documented racial insensitivity issue in the past. Tamla's sister-in-law, Terry Blanco, said that Tamla's race, quote, might have something to do with why this case wasn't more investigated in the beginning, end quote. It's really important to note that Tamla was the only Black person at the party that night, and although it's near impossible to prove at this point, this statement captures the family's frustrations because they felt that things were being overlooked and that race absolutely could have played a part in what happened to Tamla. Between this fact and the extensive racist history in Forsyth County, it makes total sense why the family felt this way. As expected, the sheriff's office stood by investigation's integrity. In response to the growing whispers, Sheriff Ron Freeman even stated that if any new evidence or credible information emerged, that they were prepared to reopen the case. At the time of closing the case in February 2019, Freeman emphasized that they had found no evidence of foul play and had no reason to continue on investigating. The people at the party, specifically Jean Myers, hired legal counsel as speculation about murder continued to ramp up about her. In late February, the attorneys representing Jean, Jose, and the others who were present issued a public statement defending their clients. They stressed that everyone had cooperated fully with law enforcement, answering every question, and that, quote, our clients are completely innocent. This was not murder. This was not anything other than a tragic accident, end quote. They also revealed that some of the partygoers and their family had begun to receive death threats from individuals online who believed that Tamla was murdered, and the group were all participating in covering it up together. The lawyers pleaded for the community to please stop the harassment, reinforcing the official finding was accidental death and that these rumors were causing serious harm to innocent people. By mid-2019, Tamla's family was voicing that they were not convinced by the official story, though. Her husband, Lee, and others close to Tamla quietly began to seek getting their own answers. They gathered the documents that the sheriff's office had released, including the incident report, witness statements, and so on, and hired an attorney named Ralph E. Fernandez to scrutinize the evidence and conduct an independent inquiry on their behalf. Fernandez assembled a small team and dove into the case files looking for any inconsistencies or signs of a botched investigation. Over late 2019 and into early 2020, Fernandez's team identified several points of concern. According to a letter that he wrote, they found that the witness statements did conflict each other on certain details and that, quote, a potential subject, end quote, which was a reference to someone at the party, had handled the body as well as the evidence prior to law enforcement arriving. He also mentioned that some evidence had been disposed of. He was likely referring to the fact that the homeowner's aunt had touched Tamla's body to see if she was still alive and possibly moved an arm, or that someone might have straightened Tamla's legs before the police got there, which absolutely would contaminate the crime scene. Also, some of Tamla's personal items, like the glass that she had been drinking from, or potentially any vomit on the ground, may have been cleaned up or lost in the immediate aftermath, just due to people not realizing that a death had even occurred at that time. Another issue that he pointed out was the absence of autopsy photos, calling, quote, this is unheard of, end quote, in his experience. The lack of these photos meant that he couldn't visually verify the described injuries or see if there were marks that the report didn't mention. He also stated that Tamla's extensive injuries were consistent with those found in a physical struggle, implying that if the case was approached as a potential homicide from the beginning, the distribution of those injuries could indicate a fight scenario. However, without those images, his team couldn't be certain. Essentially, Fernandez was arguing that the possibility of homicide had not fully 100% been ruled out and that the investigation left reasonable questions unanswered. On June 5, 2020, Ralph Fernandez wrote a detailed letter to Tamla's widower, Tamla Horsford, summarizing all of these findings and concerns. A few days later, an Atlanta journalist obtained this letter and published it, bringing this information to the public eye. Fernandez's conclusions was that this case, quote, strongly suggested homicide, end quote. He didn't accuse anyone specifically, but he made it clear that in his view, this was not an open and shut accident. He listed the various potential investigative failures like conflicting witness accounts, possible tampering, lack of key forensics, all as a justification that the case deserved to be reopened and examined independently. Fernandez ended the letter with a heartfelt note to the Horsford family saying, quote, "This case is not over. It will never be over. Be safe, be strong. We will get to the bottom of this," end quote. Local protesters in Georgia carried signs with Tamla's name and posted it all over social media, which made this case go viral. Celebrities joined in on demanding authorities to take another look at Tamla's death. They cited the Fernandez's letter as a suggestion of possible homicide and urged for answers. Other public figures like Kim Kardashian also later acknowledged Tamla's case in the context of seeking justice. Perhaps the most powerful show of public pressure, though, was when a Change.org petition had been signed calling for an official reinvestigation of Tamla Horsford's death. That petition gained over 700,000 signatures in a very short period of time. It became clear that a large number of people did not feel comfortable with the case being closed, as an accident at least. Sheriff Ron Freeman, who in 2019 had said that he would reopen the case if any new information came out, now had a new mandate from the public opinion to do so. Sheriff Freeman responded fairly quickly. On June 12, 2020, Sheriff Freeman formally sent out a request letter to the Georgia Bureau of Investigations to reopen Tamla Horsford's case and have the GBI take over that investigation. In his letter to the GBI director, Vic Reynolds, Freeman wrote, quote, "Renewed requests for reexamination are best served by an independent law enforcement agency," end quote. He basically acknowledged that it would be wise to let a neutral agency outside review to ensure public trust. He assured the GBI that this office would fully cooperate and give them complete access to all the evidence and anything else necessary. Freeman's stance was that he still believed that his team had done a thorough job, but he understood the value of having an independent second look in laying any doubts to rest. The GBI agreed. On June 18, 2020, the GBI announced that it would reopen and officially investigate Tamla Horsford's death as requested. This news was welcomed by the family and protesters. A GBI spokesperson told the media that the case had been accepted for review, though at the time they did not give any specific timeline or details about how the investigation would proceed. Also around that time, Tamla's family released more information to the public. On news segments, Tamla's close friends and family shared that, quote, "They have to know the truth," end quote, and laid out why they felt the original investigation was incomplete. They pointed out things like deputies never subpoenaed the partygoers' phones during the initial investigation. It later came out that police hadn't confiscated or thoroughly analyzed the cell phones of the witnesses in 2018. They had asked the women to voluntarily share photos or videos from that party, and some were given, but they did not seize devices or obtain forensic downloads of messages at that time. This meant any text conversations between partygoers about the events of that night were not looked at. By 2020, some witnesses had new phones, and some old data like text messages had long been since deleted. That was one investigative gap that the family really felt had been missed. Another was the lack of autopsy pictures and the decision not to do things like the fingernail scrapings or a kit to test for bodily fluids on Tamla. By publicly airing these points out, the family kept pressure on the system and ensured that the reinvestigation would be thorough. With the case reopened in mid-June 2020, the GBI took the lead on a comprehensive reexamination of Tamla Horsford's death. Again, is this not all eerily similar to Kendrick Johnson's case and the medical examiner being in the same office? I couldn't shake that feeling as I continued my research in this, but the GBI investigators started from scratch with the advantage of all the original materials at their disposal. Their job was to independently verify the facts and determine if any evidence or foul play had been missed or if any new evidence could be uncovered. The GBI obtained the complete Forsyth County Sheriff's Office case file, which included the initial incident reports, crime scene photos and measurements, witness interview transcripts, and the autopsy and toxicology reports, as well as any other supplemental information. GBI agents went over these materials meticulously, checking for any inconsistencies or leads that might merit further digging. GBI investigators interviewed Tamla's husband, Leander, and other family members to find out about any concerns or additional context they may have. The agents re-interviewed many of the key witnesses, including the people who were at the party earlier but had left. By the time GBI got involved, over 18 months had passed since Tamla's death, though. Re-interviewing witnesses later can be challenging. Memories may fade or even evolve, and people might have discussed the events with each other, or by the time GBI got involved, over 18 months had passed since Tamla's death. Re-interviewing witnesses later on can be challenging. Memories may fade or even evolve, and people might have discussed the events with each other or read other things online that may influence their memory. Still, it was an essential part of the investigation. The GBI wanted to see if any witnesses would reveal something new or if any contradictions arose between comparing their 2018 to 2020 statements, and GBI agents did something that the sheriff's detectives hadn't. They subpoenaed and obtained cell phone records for all of those involved. This included pulling phone logs, text messages, and any social media or messaging apps that could have been accessed during that time frame. By doing this, they really hoped to reconstruct communications around the time of Tamla's death. Did anyone text or call around 1:50 or 2 in the morning? Did anyone message a friend in the days after indicating something had happened? Given that nearly a year and a half had passed, retrieving actual content of messages may have been hit or miss, though. Also, at least 2 of the people had since replaced their phones between 2018 to 2020, and some data had no longer been on their devices. The GBI learned that some pictures from the party and messages were also gone, possibly deleted during routine phone changes or intentionally out of privacy concerns when the rumor mill heated up. Still, they collected whatever was available, including the 911 call audio, surveillance system logs, and more. The GBI forensic labs could also re-examine the physical evidence. They had access to the tequila bottle, Tamla's clothing, the autopsy tissue samples, and more. It's not indicated that they exhumed Tamla's body since a full autopsy had been done and a second independent one was done as well. In fact, the final GBI report reaffirmed the medical findings. Quote, "The observed injuries are consistent with those received in a fall," unquote, the autopsy report stated, explicitly matching the patterns expected from a 14-foot fall. That line shows GBI's medical staff did not deviate from the original cause of death finding. The GBI also revisited the absence of certain tests in the original autopsy. They discussed internally and with the family's attorneys why no fingernail clippings or assault kits had been taken at that time. Just like the sheriff's department found, their spokesperson clarified that since nothing at the scene had suggested a struggle, those steps weren't taken. During the reinvestigation, the GBI did not find any evidence that these steps should have been taken. For instance, had Tamla been violated, they would expect to see torn clothing or injuries in specific areas in the autopsy, but none had been reported. And if there was a violent fight, there should be bruising on Tamla's knuckles, maybe from her hitting someone else or on another person at the party, in addition to foreign DNA under Tamla's nails from scratching an attacker. The family's side worried that evidence may have been missed by not checking these, though, but apparently the GBI didn't turn up anything either. On July 28, 2021, the GBI investigation officially concluded the case and released their findings to the public. The conclusion was one that mirrored the original 2019 outcome. No evidence of foul play was found, and no criminal charges would be pursued in connection with Tamla Horsford's death. The GBI's report reaffirmed several key points. Multiple blunt force injuries were consistent with a fall from height. The severe injuries, including the head trauma, broken neck vertebra, and lacerated heart, were mentioned once again. The high blood alcohol level, the 0.238, and presence of THC and Xanax were confirmed as factors in their case per their investigation, at least. They found that her impairment likely contributed to the accident. The GBI explicitly stated that they had found no indications of an assault or struggle either. The Forsyth County Sheriff's Office, in response to the GBI's findings, reiterated, quote, "No evidence or injury patterns indicative of an assault or foul play were noted by the Forsyth County Sheriff's detectives, the coroner's office, or GBI medical examiner's reports," end quote. Any inconsistencies flagged by the family's attorney didn't amount to anything. For example, while witness memories might have slightly differed, like Jean's recollection of her arm position, they were not significant enough to suggest a cover-up. The timeline of events were consistent, and nobody's account was found to be false when compared against physical evidence. The GBI's investigation also addressed the issues that attorney Ralph Fernandez raised. They did not find, for example, that any evidence was maliciously destroyed. The quote, "unheard of," end quote, lack of autopsy photos was acknowledged, but didn't hide any findings. GBI pathologists had the body and report to rely on, and they agreed with the original autopsy. After the GBI's announcement, the Forsyth County Sheriff's Office released a statement essentially saying that they felt vindicated. They reminded the public that they had always been open to new information and that none was found by saying, quote, "At the request of the family, we took another look into the evidence and also had an independent agency, the GBI, look over the initial findings. No additional information has been found," end quote. They added that they remained willing to reopen the case once again if any new evidence came to light. But at that time, the case was considered thoroughly investigated and closed. After the GBI finished, they submitted their findings to the DA for review. The DA concluded that there was no basis for criminal charges. There was simply no evidence that any individual had caused Tamla's injuries or death. No one at the party had motive or history of violence that could have been substantiated, and no confession or direct clue ever emerged. In the wake of the GBI's closure, Tamla's family attorney, Ralph Fernandez, reacted by saying, quote, "We're not going away," end quote, meaning that the family still didn't accept these findings. He thanked the GBI for their time, but indicated that he would continue to seek answers, possibly through civil avenues or continued advocacy. By this time, however, with the case closed twice, there were really limited options remaining. Even after the GBI closed the case in 2021, Tamla Horsford's death remains a subject of constant discussion, reflection, and for some suspicion. That's why we're here today. Tamla's family continues to mourn her loss. She left behind a husband and 6 children who have had to grapple with not only her absence, but with the painful investigation. Tamla was a devoted mother and a ray of light in her community, making her sudden and strange death all the more tragic. Family and friends describe her as a loving, energetic woman who brought joy to everyone around her. They've had to balance that memory with the horrifying details of how she died throughout all of this. In 2022, her family decided to release the full independent autopsy report that they had commissioned. It was initially kept private, but by May 2022, they shared it with the investigative journalists and the public. The reason that they said was because, quote, "there were facts authorities never considered," unquote, and they wanted complete transparency for the public. The independent autopsy report mirrored the GBI findings, but highlighted some things like a lack of certain types of hemorrhaging that might have been expected if Tamla was alive for a long time after the fall. In other words, possibly suggesting that she died very quickly. It also emphasized that Tamla had injuries on her arms and her hands, like the cut on her wrist, that the family interprets as possible defensive wounds. Tamla's family expressed gratitude for the public's support, but also disappointment that no one had been held accountable. One of their lingering feelings is that even if Tamla had fallen by accident, there may have been negligence, like someone heard her fall and didn't act, or the delay in calling 911, like from 7:30 in the morning to 8:59 when they called the police. That may have been a difference between her surviving or dying. The people at the house explained that when Madeline had first found Tamla, they weren't sure what to do. Madeline thought that maybe she saw Tamla sleeping outside and was confused, and when they realized the severity, they had to gather themselves before calling. There was also mention that one person at the house wanted to call 911 immediately, while another suggested waiting to be sure that Tamla was indeed beyond help. By the time Jose called, rigor mortis had set in, so any delay likely didn't change Tamla's fate. But the optics of not calling right away led to many suspicions. Why wait? The GBI looked at the phone records in the gap in time to see if anyone called someone else, like a lawyer or a friend first, and no such calls were reported. It seems that it was just a moment of shock and disorganization with people who had never dealt with this type of situation before, but to be honest, we can't know for sure, so weigh in the comments down below and let me know your thoughts. In traumatic moments, people tend to do strange things like the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, but I do find it odd that an entire group of people all froze when typically there's some diversity of responses within a group. Tamla Horsford's case shows how a tragic accident can be interpreted in different ways and how crucial it is for authorities to be transparent and thorough to maintain public trust. It also emphasizes how public pressure can ensure accountability. Had the public not pushed, the GBI probably wouldn't have reinvestigated. Her family keeps her memory alive and continues to celebrate her life outside of just the manner of her death. As of now, no one faces any criminal suspicion in Tamla's death. The final word from law enforcement is that Tamla Horsford's death was a tragic accident due to a night of partying that unfortunately turned deadly due to a perfect storm of alcohol, momentary missteps, and gravity. Tamla Horsford's story resonates because it sits at the intersection of tragedy and a larger theme of trust in the justice system. It reminds us that behind every investigation is a real person, a mother, a wife, a friend, who is deeply missed every day by those who loved her. While the official conclusion may be an accidental death, the impact of Tamla's loss and the lessons that have been learned from the scrutiny of her case will absolutely have a ripple effect far beyond this investigation. Her family's pursuit of answers, even against all odds, stands as a testament to their love for Tamla and their desire to ensure that her death was not dismissed without due examination. In the end, the hope is that Tamla Horsford is remembered not just for how she died, but for who she was in life, and that her story might prevent similar tragedies or at least improve how they're investigated in the future. Tamla's story came highly requested, and I appreciate all of you for mentioning her to me. It truly is a privilege to tell the story of those that can no longer speak for themselves, so keep them coming, guys. I appreciate each and every one of you from the very bottom of my heart. I know that there's a stigma for parasocial relationships, but on my end, I really am forming bonds with so many of you, and I am unbelievably grateful for that. If nobody else has told you today, I am grateful for you. Have a great week, nurses' orders, and don't forget our secret handshake. I'll see you guys next time.